to start here. This is an older talk, and this is a talk I actually gave for the Museum of New Mexico Foundation and for the Friends of the History Museum up in Santa Fe some years ago. It actually isn't the talk I wanted to give you guys today, but unfortunately, in everything of reopening, I really am working on a talk that has to do with Spanish light horse and the tradition of Spanish light horse or cavalry in the colonial period that I want to get to at some point, but it's not what I was able to get to now. And so today I'm just sharing a fun talk with you. I'm going to talk about 7 bizarre and informative artifacts found behind the Palace of the Governors. The Palace of the Governors, of course, is located in Santa Fe, and we'll talk a little bit about that and how I'm connected with the project. As many of you might know, I actually started my career with the Department of Cultural Affairs back in 2002, doing work here at the Palace of the Governors. So if you look closely, you'll even see a picture or two with me with hair in it in this work. And this is all pictures of some of the excavations behind the Palace of the Governors. Now, I say it's behind the Palace of the Governors, but actually part of the Palace of the Governors during this time period. So those stone alignments you see there represent the foundations of walls associated with the palace as it existed in the 18th century. So just a brief background on the Palace of the Governors as a whole. The palace was established circa 1610. I say circa 1610 because there's actually evidence, there's some evidence that suggests people were living in Santa Fe prior to 1610 when it was officially created. The villa was officially created. But the Palace of the Governors from 1610 onwards up until the late 19th century was the political and military capital of New Mexico, of the province of New Mexico. And it maintained this role right up to being converted ultimately to a museum. So it's a very important building in our history of New Mexico, in the history of the American Southwest, and the history of the United States. Now, what you see today is certainly not the building that existed back in the day. In fact, I've led several, since it's been closed to the public, I've led several tours of the architectural elements that you can see now that they've pulled all the exhibits out of the building to really discuss the architectural history of the building. But today I'm going to focus on artifacts. But in addition to being the center of history, most major events that happened in New Mexico, it's important to note that almost anything I say about the Palace of the Governors, whether it be architectural history, when it was built, what rooms were used at what times, and how it was viewed. Is it on top of a pueblo known as Ogopoge? These things are debated. Even though I've done archaeology behind below the Palace of the Governors and behind it, many of these things are debated. Even it's different how big the palace was, or how when certain portions were established, and so on and so forth. But also debating the history of even important officials and their roles at the palace are often debated as time goes on. So there's a lot of controversy, as with any really popular historic place. Excavations behind the palace, which I initially worked on, occurred between 2002 and 2004. And in fact, if you look down that trench there's a younger me with hair standing there staring at something. I think Susan's digging at a rock, and I'm staring down at Susan, wondering what she's pointing at. Interestingly enough, one of the artifacts that I'm going to talk about today was actually found pretty much where I'm standing in that photo. So as I excavated that unit that I'm then standing in. The excavations were done by the Office of Archaeological Studies under the direction of Stephen Post, who was at the time a project director for the Office of Archaeological Studies. It resulted in the approximately the documentation of about 200 features and the collection of about 750,000 artifacts. And these included things like native ceramics, metal, glass, bone, etc. Now, all these artifacts that were collected were separated into different categories, and archaeologists have different ways of breaking them out. But one of the most common ways to do it is to break out fauna in native ceramic, in flake stone, and macrobotanical and groundstone. But there's this category known as Euro-American. Pretty much all the metal, glass, and pottery of non-local manufacture, which means it wasn't made by the Pueblo peoples, is all put in this Euro-American category. So it's kind of like a catch-all. In this case, the Euro-American artifacts were subjected to a function-based analysis that focused on identifying human activities, which occurred on the site and the patterning of human behavior. And this method of function-based analysis really comes out of a book which is now a decade, maybe even 50 years old, but it's decades old now. It's called Method and Theory in Historical Archaeology. And if most of you know, probably by my talks, I am a historical archaeologist by both training and desire. I tend to focus on the contact period and the contact and colonial periods, but I've also worked in industrial communities. I've mining camps, as well as agricultural communities in rural New Mexico on a wide array of things. And I was one of the analysts that ended up doing this function-based analysis. And it was on me, even though a lot of different people worked on the function-based analysis, it fell on my shoulders to lead the interpretation and write-up of this material culture. So where does this material culture, where do these Euro-American artifacts come from? Well, they come from a lot of different places. And we analyzed a sample of about 30,000 Euro-American artifacts. So not every artifact was analyzed, not every nail was scrutinized, but a substantial representative sample, which included bottle glass, nails, European pottery, and a plethora of other artifacts. And these all came from a wide array of places. In fact, it's important to note that the Palace of the Governors was actually located at the end point debated to be the end point, because even that, like, does the El Camino Real go up to Taos? Maybe. Does it go up to Espanola? But the Palace of the Governors was kind of the point along three major trails. And those trails were the El Camino Real, the Santa Fe Trail, and the Old Spanish Trail. Later, it was also attached to mercantile ventures back east through the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway. And there was several other trails we could talk about there too. But all of these things allowed people living and working at the Palace of the Governors to purchase items that were manufactured all over the globe, right? So that these are not materials. Euro-American artifacts are, by their definition, not necessarily locally produced items by Native American peoples. They represent the other, the objects brought in by colonists, the objects brought in by indigenous peoples in Mexico, the objects brought in by Anglo-Americans traveling along the Santa Fe Trail. It was artifacts brought in from California along the Old Spanish Trail, and so on and so forth. And collectively, these materials ran the gamut. I mean, people lived at the palace. They conducted war out of the palace. It was the center of government. So a broad array of activities occurred at the palace at any one time. So it was a hodgepodge of different things. Normally, you don't have the diversity of material culture on a site the way you have it at the palace. The palace had lots and lots of different items. And certainly it represented a lot of different historic periods, everything from the Spanish colonial period, the Mexican period, the American territorial period, and early New Mexico statehood were all represented, as well as some of the prehistoric periods, including the Coalition and Classic period, where we found material culture associated with Ogopoge, which wasn't right underneath the Palace of the Governors, but a few blocks over, and excavated as a different project by myself and Steve Lentz. But for this, you do 30,000 artifacts. And yes, I could make this a summary of all 30,000 artifacts, and it would be confusing because it's so many different time periods and it represents so many different cultures and so many different activities going on that it would just be a hodgepodge of a story. But while every artifact has a story to tell, some of those are like more interesting than others. So for this talk, I'm going to focus on 7 just really interesting artifacts that I think could tell you something both about the history of the palace and maybe some broader insights into New Mexico as a whole during this time period. Some of these I've touched upon in other lectures, and others will probably be incredibly new to you. Maybe even things you've never heard of. So I'm doing 7, and I'm just going to plot them off just like you would see on any like list that you would click through on your web browser, or watch on YouTube, or watch on the TV show where you get those top 10 shows. Well, I chose 7. So here's the top 7 fascinating artifacts at the Palace of the Governors, as studied by Matthew Barber, who is the historical archaeologist and the one in charge of writing up Euro-American artifacts. So I'm not going to focus on any indigenous artifacts made in New Mexico today. I am going to talk about some indigenous artifacts, but number 1, I'm going to call it the Spanish olive jar. Now, this is a whole vessel. We did not find a whole vessel at the Palace of the Governors, but I wanted to show you what these look like. Spanish olive jar is probably also known and probably better described as an Iberian storage vessel. And these Iberian storage vessels are part of a long legacy of these amorpha-shaped pots that were thrown on the wheel and glazed on the inside with a lead glaze to prevent seepage. And if you think back and you look at this shape and you go, that kind of looks like what the Greeks had. It totally is. It's the same kind of pottery vessel that Phoenicians used, that the Romans used, that Spain used, both under the Phoenicians and under the Carthaginians and under the Romans. And remember, Carthaginians is just another word for really it's an empire that comes later, but they're descended, they're ethnically initially Phoenicians. Any rate, these olive jars were used in the colonial period by the Spanish to transport both wet and dry goods, including olives, which probably doesn't surprise you at all that olives were transferred into something that was transferred into a vessel like this, hence the name. But they also served for wine, water, oil, beans, chickpeas, and all sorts of other items. So these are huge vessels. I know there's no size on this one, but these things can be more than 2 feet in diameter, and height-wise be up to, I think there's some examples that are up to 4 feet in height, but most are much smaller than that. These vessels, which, as you can imagine, were manufactured in Europe, in the Mediterranean, are clear examples of the global trade networks that the Spanish were running in the colonial period. By the establishment of the Palace of the Governors in the early 17th century, Spain was part of a global empire. And what we have here is a depiction of what that empire looked like. And if you look at the map here, you'll see there is a blue trade network. That is the Portuguese shipping lines. And then you have this whitish or grayish colored line, which is the Spanish. Remember, these two empires are united under the Iberian Union at this point. And if you'll notice, there's a dotted line that kind of connects both trade networks. So technically, goods from Manila were supposed to go back through what we would call Mexico today to Acapulco. But the reality is sometimes they made their way over to Macau, which is pretty much adjacent to modern day Hong Kong, and sometimes over into the Indonesian islands, and points of that way. It's important to note that on all of these, so I'm giving you a broad picture of the world where you find Spanish people in this broad view of the New World, whether you're talking about the Philippines and Manila, whether you're talking about Acapulco, whether you're talking about Panama, which is where I grew up as a little kid. Typically on all of these archaeological sites or historic sites throughout the world, when you find Spanish settlement, usually the most common type of European ceramic found on all of these settlements is the Spanish olive jar. In fact, in 1965, archaeologist John Goggin characterized the olive jar as the 5-gallon oil can of colonial times. It was everywhere. Or perhaps to put that into even more modern terms, it's the Tupperware that you keep in your kitchen. And everybody has at least several pieces of Tupperware. Maybe not Tupperware brand, but the same kind of concept, right? You have those resealable plastic bins. Same thing for the olive jar. Spanish olive jar fragments represented just over 30% of the entire Euro-American ceramic assemblage from Spanish colonial deposits at the Palace of the Governors. So pretty much 1 in 3 pottery sherds from the Spanish colonial period of Euro-American manufacture was a Spanish olive jar fragment. We're seeing some of those fragments here. In fact, on the right-hand side, you can see one of those olive jar fragments shaped into a gaming piece. It is often the only European manufactured artifact encountered on 17th and 18th century New Mexico archaeological sites. So this often is all you get to show you it's a Spanish colonial site. And these artifacts, in the presence of these artifacts, remember this tradition of these vessels really goes back for a very long time. And it links Hispanic colonists not only with the Spanish Empire, but a much older Mediterranean identity, which we'll focus on with some of the other artifacts to come. Now, I said there was an artifact found where I was standing in the photo, and this is that artifact right here. So our number 2 artifact is, of course, gold, because of anybody who's asked me anything about the Palace of the Governors, and the most joking question ever asked is, did you find gold? And absolutely, we found gold. That sounds terrible. Well, we didn't find much gold, but this is a gold-plated earring found at the Palace of the Governors. I actually found it. And I have to caveat that a little bit because while I found it, it's my name associated with digging it out of the ground. I actually didn't find it. When we were digging that trench, this was the first unit in that trench you saw that we were digging. And I was digging it, and this was my first excavation at the Palace of the Governors. I was super excited. It was very dark in this trench. And as archaeologists do, I was scraping the unit and grabbing the earth and throwing it into a bucket. One of my volunteers found this gold ring in the screen. And it could be an earring, it could be horse furniture, but it's gold-plated silver. And if you'll notice, it's got a loop that goes through the ear or onto the horse's bridle, but then there's also 3 smaller circles in which dangles would have come off of. The motif was actually, we had other archaeologists looked at, and one argued that it's very reminiscent of Middle Eastern goat imagery, which not that surprising. Also, a very similar earring appears in Kathleen Deegan's book on artifacts of the Spanish colonies out of Florida. And a similar earring to this one was actually found in the Caribbean, approximately dating to around the same time period. And I want to make clear, you're looking at the 17th century here. This was found in clear 17th century deposits. So this was something adorned by somebody in the 1600s at the Palace of the Governors. Now, what you might not know, why is that a fascinating artifact? Well, gold's always fascinating. Well, sort of, yeah. It's important to note, and a lot of people get very negative about the Spanish colonial enterprise in New Mexico. It was very poor. They were poor people. And that's not always the case. In fact, the first thing you should know about the Spanish is that the Spanish Empire was extraordinarily wealthy. The early colonial period, they were fueled by their conquests and colonial enterprises. There was lots and lots of money. And unlike the Protestants, so if you were to go to New England in the 1600s, they wore very practical clothes. They didn't wear a lot of jewelry and decoration. That is not the case amongst the Spanish settlers. In fact, in their dowries, in their wills, we see lots and lots of fancy clothing and adornment. In fact, this lady here is a perfect example. You'll notice that she's wearing a gold, you'll notice she has an earring that has pearls in it, but you'll notice there's a gold hook thing and 3 little dangles hanging from it, which is why I used it as an example of how that piece might have been worn by a member of the Spanish aristocracy at the Palace of the Governors. You'll also notice her clothes are almost gold. Now that's all, that gold-laced attire is actually galloon. It's a copper thread that is gone. It makes your clothes look like gold. Much of the value in Spanish households, even in New Mexico, when they did lists of everything they had, a lot of their wealth was tied to their clothing. Identity, the jewelry they wore, the clothing they wore was very much tied to their socioeconomic status in their community. And it's important to note that Santa Fe is, even if it's a remote capital, it's a provincial capital in this larger global empire that we see here. Once again, we've separated out the Spanish holdings from those of the Portuguese, but under the Iberian Union, these are all the same. In fact, what you're looking at here is the different, if you remember the Philip II lecture, you're looking at some of the management provinces of the Spanish Empire at different times. And there was a lot of great wealth, with the highest quantity of wealth, the most wealth in New Mexico being concentrated in Santa Fe. And then even in that cluster of the greatest wealth in Santa Fe, the most wealth in Santa Fe was clustered at the Palace of the Governors. So yes, finding gold in the archaeological record is possible and does happen. And it's important to note, that many of our perceptions from the historical record of the people in New Mexico as poor or downtrodden are largely a result of not them living under the Spanish Empire, but the result of Anglo-American accounts written after the collapse of that empire. So the deterioration, the lack of funding during the Mexican period, and racial ideas as to the people in Santa Fe and elsewhere in New Mexico being inferior. But when we look in the archaeological record, they do show up as very wealthy sometimes. Not all of the times, but sometimes. There were both rich people and poor people in the province. Following along those same lines of adornment, I'm going to switch to an artifact that I know I have talked to this group about before, but I think it's worth re-mentioning it. It was one of the 7 artifacts I picked. So you're going to hear a little bit of repeat for those of you who've gone and listened to my Higa lecture here. But these are jet Higas found at the Palace of Governors. So these are made of jet, which is a highly compact form of pretty much coal. That is carved and shaped, and these are identical to pieces found throughout the Spanish Empire. But what they're depicting is a clenched hand in which the thumb is between the fore and middle finger, and they're often worn around the neck or on horses. Sometimes they can be shown. But the archaeological examples of these have been found throughout the empire, including multiple examples at the Palace of the Governors and examples throughout the Santa Fe area. And these aren't very big, as you can notice by the scale. This is actually a much larger than life-size depiction of what these materials look like. Now, it might occur to you that I just said they were found all over the Palace of the Governors. These were actually illegal symbols. You weren't legally allowed to wear these. These symbols were associated with Roman rites that pre-existed the Christian religion. In fact, they had to do with the Lemuria ritual and the banishing of evil spirits. In fact, if you do that thumb between the fore and middle fingers today, it might tell somebody, F off, as it were. It's pretty crude. But really what they're telling you is, get away from me, you demon. So don't go do that in a Latin country today, because they will see that as a sign of disrespect if you do that to them. But it was linked with the protection against evil in all forms, especially the evil eye later on. It was actually forbidden by Charles here. This is King Charles I, who you might know better as Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. But he actually banned the use of jet Higas in his laws in 1525. So he said, this is not a Christian symbol. Stop wearing these. Nobody listened to him, especially not those people who would eventually settle in New Mexico. In fact, this is a great example of folk Catholicism, which is a concept we've come back to a couple different times, because the distribution of these items is not equitable. Most appear in secular, administrative, and residential contexts associated with the wealthiest echelons of colonial society. Poor people do not wear Higas. They probably don't have access to them, but they also probably don't identify to them. It's the rich Spaniards in Santa Fe, in the rich Spaniards in Mexico City, is the rich Spaniards in Havana that wear these items. The people who wear these items don't view themselves probably as mestizos. They view themselves maybe as Spanish, but probably even more so as Romans, as continuers of the great empires that came before them, the true rulers of Western Europe and the purveyors of Latin identity. And perhaps not surprisingly, this is probably one of the practices that put many of the settlers, the wealthier Hispanic families, at odds with the Catholic priests or the Franciscan missionaries operating the area, which they did have a contentious relationship with, because these are not necessarily good practicing Catholics. These are people who practice the traditions of their communities in Spain, or their communities, and I use that term broadly, within the Mediterranean, the greater Latin Empire that Spain is the descendants of, regardless of whether they are actually of German descent or Italian descent living in Santa Fe, which there were fewer, obviously. But similarly, Spanish not being Spanish, Castilian, Catalan, whatever ethnicity they necessarily link to, they're linking back to an earlier identity associated with their Roman heritage. And of course, we can even see that in the use of the word Hispanic, right? In New Mexico, we use the word Hispanic, which is tied to, of course, the notion of Hispania, and which is a Roman province in and of itself. The history of the word Hispania goes back to it being a Roman province. So when we say Hispanic, we are in essence identifying Spanish-speaking peoples in that tradition, whether we knowingly do so or not. Okay. So the richer people identified with these, I want to go back to this because it's going to be important. The richer people identified with these Higas, right? They viewed themselves as very European. They viewed themselves as very connected with what's going on elsewhere in their empire, to this broader identity of being the descendants of this earlier empire. The poorer people did not. And in fact, this is an artifact we associate with a much lower economic scale, like a lower economic status person located at the Palace of the Governors and elsewhere. This pottery type is known as Guadalajara Polychrome. If you'll remember back to my discussions on Oñate in the Mixton War, one of the most famous things Cristobal Oñate did, one day Oñate's dad, was he founded a lot of cities in what we would call Mexico today. One of those cities was Guadalajara, which he named after Guzman's hometown in Spain. This pottery here is manufactured, or was manufactured, in the city of Guadalajara during the 17th and 18th centuries. It was made primarily by native and mestizo potters, most likely of Tarascan or Caxcan origin. If you remember, the Caxcanes were the ones who actually fought in the Mixton War against the Spanish. At this point, they're all in on the empire, and they're making pottery. However, some people argue that this is actually a derivative of Aztec pottery, and they actually it's actually been referred to in some publications as Aztec 4, a colonial period version of the Aztec pottery sequence. It does certainly bear a striking resemblance to the Valley of Mexico pottery types. However, much of Mesoamerica used polychrome designs similar to these, and I don't know. I don't even want to. I don't want to speculate on that, especially when we know the origin place of this pottery type is not Mexico City; it's in Guadalajara. So how the tradition, if the tradition is descended from Mexico City, I don't want to necessarily venture a guess directly as to why that pottery tradition specifically moved to Guadalajara in the area occupied by Caxcanes and Tarascans in the 17th and 18th century, neither of which are Mexica Indians. They're Tarascans being de Perpetua. And I apologize for my phone going off. Okay, so what do these pottery represent? Well, Guadalajara polychrome is found also, just like the Higas, found throughout the Spanish colonies and in the courts of Europe. However, it's not associated with European identity, and archaeologists have struggled to come up for an explanation for its wide distribution. And there's two conflicting theories, or possibly conflicting theories. One of them is that if you go into the historical record, one of the things people say about this pottery and why it was sought, bought, and sold is that the clay of this pots were supposed to instill magic properties into the water housed in the vessel. So you could put water in these vessels, and then the clay, which is it's like a gray clay from the Guadalajara region, is supposed to like the water is supposed to mix with the clay, and it doesn't really, but and you throw it on your face, and it cures acne and skin condition issues. And that sounds good. So maybe households had these as a way of curing acne. However, most people have pointed out a more darker interpretation, which is it's very clear that this pottery only shows up in areas where we believe Coxcon and Tarascan peoples were settled in the empire, likely as either slaves or as servants. And so an alternative explanation is not that, well, it would be nice and maybe it could cure acne, but realistically, when you see this, you're seeing the remnants of the slaves that came with the Spanish, or the slaves or the servants that came with these gentrified nobles on their colonial adventures. In fact, the reason we probably see so much Guadalajara polychrome in the American Southwest is the fact that the Oñate family and many of the early settling families from New Mexico were actually centered in the Guadalajara and Zacatecas region. So they came from this area, and their servants would as well. In fact, a recent article by Elizabeth Oster puts the Barrio de Analco as primarily being settled by Caxcani or Tarascan servants. The Barrio de Analco being the neighborhood south of the Santa Fe River in Santa Fe, where many of the early indigenous peoples from central Mexico lived. Now, I did just say some of that. Now I notice it's in the next slide. But I want to point out something else here, because I did mention Elizabeth Oster's argument. But one of the more striking things that's been brought up, and I wouldn't be surprised if you see this again brought up in an article later this year in the volume. We have the volume coming out in honor of James Conder, a friend of Kuaua, that will be out later this year, in which David Snow is going to tackle the Indios Amigos, the Native Americans that came up with the Spanish, mostly during the Coronado expedition, but I think he's going to talk about later times. One of the arguments he made when he was a younger archaeologist, obviously, this was years ago, I think it was in the 80s, he made the argument, he didn't, I'll be honest, he didn't go out too much on a limb, but he made a very striking observation. He said, this Guadalajara polychrome stuff, it looks a lot like Tewa-produced historic pottery. So pottery made by local peoples in New Mexico after the arrival of the Spanish. I jumped on this in a later paper known as Mexican Ceramic Traditions in New Mexico, or something like that, or Mexican Ceramic Traditions in Spanish Colonial New Mexico, something along those lines. It was published over a decade ago now. And I took it a little bit farther, and I just looked at the distribution of Guadalajara polychrome, where it shows up, and then where we see these wares that look similar being produced by indigenous peoples in New Mexico. For example, Guadalajara polychrome shows up, and then all of a sudden, Tewa people start to make Tewa polychrome, and then later Punami polychrome that appear to copy some of the designs. Native American peoples in New Mexico, in the region of the Tewa Basin or the Espanola area, don't have this pottery tradition till the Spanish come up. Another great example of native Mexican pottery influencing possibly New Mexico Pueblo potteries is, of course, Oaxaca polished blackwares. And Oaxaca polished blackware shows up in the Palace of the Governors in small numbers and at other early Spanish colonial sites. In fact, I think someone was found at Yunque. And shortly thereafter, we get Santa Clara which is a neighboring Tewa community in San Ildefonso, start to make capo polished blackwares. They make their own locally produced type of polished blackwares, possibly copying along these Mesoamerican pottery traditions. And they abandoned many of their own styles. So even though up until the Spanish colonial periods, Tewa people were still making black on white pottery or black on cream pottery. Similarly, Tiwa Indians in the areas in and around Coronado Historic Site were making glazewares, right? They turned to these polychrome traditions, which appear to copy more of a design aesthetic from central Mexico than necessarily taking from the roots that existed before that. In fact, today, San Ildefonso and Santa Clara are often highly prized for their polished blackware traditions, which they did not have prehistorically. In fact, their pottery would have not been polished black, clearly not polished black before the Spanish arrived. So what else did we get there? Well, it wasn't all about the Spanish colonial period. I want to spend these last three artifacts talking about something that isn't the Spanish colonial period. So the first I'm going to show you is luggage tag. This luggage tag, which I did actually find in the ground. So this is not one where a volunteer found it in the screen for me. I actually was smart enough to recognize this for a while. I didn't recognize it as a luggage tag when I originally found it. I noticed it was a piece of metal with writing on it when I first dug it out of the ground. And I remember handing it to Steve Post, and we're both looking at it. He's like, Pyle. And he's like, that name sounds familiar. And this is before the time of smartphones. So none of us like thought anything of it. So he goes back to the office and just looks. And sure enough, with the luggage tag, as you can see here, reads W.M.A. Pyle, 517 Pine Street, St. Louis, Missouri. Damned if that wasn't William Anderson Pyle, the governor of New Mexico. That was his address in Missouri when he moved to New Mexico. He was the governor appointed by Ulysses S. Grant to the territory of New Mexico in 1869. So here's a luggage tag associated with a known governor of New Mexico found behind the Palace of the Governors. Now, Pyle had a lot of different jobs. So if you look at his life, and here's a picture of him here. He was a Methodist preacher. He was a Union general, which is how he knew Grant. He was a Republican representative from Missouri. He was the 8th New Mexico governor from 1869 to 1871. During that same period, what did he have as a title? He was the vice president of the Maxwell Land Grant and Railroad Company. Now, you might say, well, God, isn't that a conflict of interest to be the governor of the territory and also the vice president of one of the largest companies operating in the territory? It absolutely is. It absolutely is. We're going to get into why that's a problem later on. He did go on to become the ambassador of Venezuela, but I don't have his luggage tag from New Mexico heading towards Venezuela. My guess is some archaeologists in Venezuela will someday excavate the embassy and find his luggage tag from New Mexico. But I digress. So what is Pyle's legacy if he was both the head of a railroad company and the governor of New Mexico? Well, most people, when they think about territorial New Mexico, they think of something known as the Santa Fe Ring. Pyle was the first in a long line of Republican. And by Republican, I do not mean the modern day Republican Party. So the first thing, if you go, well, I'm going to equate him to Donald Trump, that doesn't work. The Republican Party at this time was the progressive party. The Democrats were the conservative party. I don't know of a good equivalent to, I'm not going to get into politics, but I'm not going to even venture a guess as to what Pyle's modern day equivalent might be in our government system. But in the late 19th or mid 19th and in early 20th centuries, the goal of these Republican governors was to keep Democrats out of the state and keep New Mexico Republican. His appointment as both governor and vice president of the Maxwell Land Grant is recognized as the beginnings of this institution known as the Santa Fe Ring. It's an institution in which we could have a whole lecture on the Santa Fe Ring, and I'm probably not the best person to talk about it, but pretty much he uses his power as governor to promote his interests, his economic interests in the Maxwell Land Grant Company. For example, he uses the U.S. Army to prevent settlers and miners from carrying firearms against the company. But the most famous thing he's known for to historians, and perhaps the most damning thing, is that when Pyle gets to the palace of the governor, so imagine he puts his luggage down out back, and he goes in there, he goes into the palace, and he sees how cluttered it is. He says, "This place is full of crap. I can't get all my luggage in here," right? Well, that's not what he really probably said, but you get the idea. I like to say this, and the little luggage tag falls off as he says this. He says, "Get this crap out of here." So under Pyle's orders, the territorial librarian Ira Bond sold and destroyed most of New Mexico's archives, or much of New Mexico's archives, to make room for office space at the palace of the governor. So he comes in, he cleans house, and as a result, we don't have a lot of the colonial documents we should have about pertaining to New Mexico, all thanks to Governor Pyle. So not only did he do some terrible things to the state, he actively tried to destroy, in essence, limited historical archival research into New Mexico's past. So as I'm doing this project at the Palace of the Governors, I'm actually identifying one of the men who made it harder to do this project in the archaeological record. Okay, a couple more artifacts. This is a funny one. I've mentioned this in several lectures before, but this is a great one. I was pretty much the only person who knew who Hunyadi Janos was when we found this bottle. But this is a bottle. This is a Hunyadi Janos bottle. The bottle was made by Andreas Slackschender of Budapest, Hungary. It was produced between about 1880 and 1920. So we're really into the American territorial and even perhaps the early statehood periods here. Hunyadi Janos, the surname is first here in this case. It's actually John Hunyadi. John Hunyadi was a famous Hungarian nobleman credited with chasing the Turks out of Hungary in the 15th century or the 1400s. In this drink that you see here that was in this bottle was patented as a medicine for curing liver piles or liver problems or piles. Piles are your hemorrhoids today. So just like Hunyadi Janos chased the Turks out of Hungary, so can Hunyadi Janos, drink or medicine chase away your hemorrhoids, right? So it's equating the Turk with something a hemorrhoid on your butt. Now, the product may have consisted of sparkling water. Certainly, that's what it was advertised. But many of the bottles you see like this, especially when you see bottles like this produced, they're usually produced in these colors of green and brown to prevent photo degradation of alcoholic drinks. That's why you see a lot of beer bottles and liquor bottles that are not clear, especially not in the American territorial beer. So this may have contained a very strong dose of alcohol in it. And it's part of this greater trend of patent medicine. Patent medicine, like Hunyadi Janos, was claimed to be, and here's a great ad about Hunyadi Janos. It's called Hunyadi water, which doesn't even make sense as a product because Hunyadi was a person. So there's not a place. It's not a place. It's a person. So it would be like saying Joe water, the only genuine Joe water. It makes absolutely no sense. Or the only genuine Clinton water. Maybe that's a better example that would make or Joe Biden water. The only genuine Joe Biden water. It doesn't work. And then linking it to the removal of hemorrhoids, you make your own judges on that. But a lot of these patent medicines were marketed in New Mexico. They're folk remedies marketed to cure a variety of illnesses. And they really flourished in the 19th century when science and pseudoscience were virtually indistinguishable from one another. And often they contained large quantities of alcohol, nicotine, or opioids and were highly addictive. So the idea is you might take it to deal with your hemorrhoids first, and it probably didn't help right the hemorrhoids. But after a few doses, you didn't care because you craved it so much. In fact, addiction to these things was a really big problem, not only in New Mexico, but throughout the country. It was a huge problem. In fact, the presence of patent medicine at the Palace of the Governors, it really demonstrates the limited healthcare options available to people in Santa Fe, even people of upper class or upper socioeconomic, of higher socioeconomic status in the 19th century. Even the wealthy and the affluent at the Palace of the Governors had to resort to these folk remedies as a substitute or supplement for proper care. While we view prescription medicine, you'll often see popular articles written today as a modern day ill. It's an ever growing problem in our country. Medicine addiction is by far and away not a new issue, disproportionately affecting the middle and upper class groups. A similar phenomenon occurred with patent medicines during the 19th and 20th centuries. The poor tended not to suffer as much from these addictions as the upper and middle class, and certainly we see that at the Palace of the Governors. Okay, lastly, one more artifact, crucibles and cupels. Lots of them. We found lots of them. What are crucibles and cupels? So the ore, the ore that's found in the Cerrillos Hills is Guyana ore. The first thing you do with that ore, if you want to, you've been mining and you've got a piece of ore and you want to know how much silver and possibly gold is in that ore, you take it to an assayer, and the assayer takes it and crushes it up and puts it in one of these vessels the vessel you see on the right hand side, which is a crucible, and he melts it down until it forms like a lead button. Then you take that button and you melt it again, you fire it again in one of these cupels, and you add a couple things to it, and there becomes a little bit at the top, and that represents how much silver or gold you have. At the Palace of the Governors, over 100 of these crucibles and cupels were found. 100 of these things. And you notice most of them are whole. I got like 6 whole examples of the cupels there and 1 crucible, and you can see all the kind of the slag on the sides of it that's been in the fire and fired multiple times. In fact, a lot of these have what almost looks like, I don't know if it is actually crayon. That's probably not the right word. A lot of times they had handwritten marks on them to distinguish what batch they were from the firing. Hundreds of these, over 100 of these was found, and probably many more. Remember, we only did a representative sample of the artifact analysis. Silver was discovered in the Cerrillos Hills in 1878, leading to the creation of the Los Cerrillos Mining District. The boom brought many businesses to Santa Fe, including assayers and mining outfitters. A survey of newspaper articles, once we found all these, I did a survey of newspaper articles, and between December of 1880 and December of 1881, an assayer by the name of G.O.H. Utter advertised his business in the Palace of the Governors. So what does this mean? There was an assayer at the Palace of the Governors. Isn't that a federal building at this point? It absolutely is. And his placement at the Palace of the Governors is not by happenstance. At the time that G.O. Utter was advertising his services at the Palace of the Governors, the then governor was Lew Wallace, and he had a business interest in the Sleeping Beauty mine. In fact, his wife, Susan Wallace, in her account of living at the Palace of the Governors, or his account of life, actually describes the assayer as a wild man with an office filled with crucibles and cupels. In fact, if you read it, it sounds like he's like a barbarian or a crazy wild man. Now, mind you, he's in the center of political authority in New Mexico. He's literally right across. The governor's looking out his office and seeing this one that's described by his wife as a wild man across in the courtyard going. Now, most people attribute Lew Wallace, of course, with the authorship of Ben-Hur, right? Most people think of him as he's sitting in his office and he's writing Ben-Hur while he's supposed to be taking care of the New Mexico, right? Now, so not the greatest impression. Well, not only was he writing that book, he was also not taking care of New Mexico while he kept his mining interested. And he was trying to get rich out here. In fact, if you can imagine, this assayer is like literally right across. There's a window in his office that looked right across from where the assayer was. He could tell not only when his samples were coming in, he could tell based upon when other people were getting good results or bad results. He knew who exactly in the territory was finding what based upon having that assayer in his building. And what's often forgotten today is that coal, copper, and silver mining were the largest businesses in territorial New Mexico. So it's not surprising that these businesses are located, that the business that determines the quality of your mine is located at the Palace of the Governors. And certainly it wasn't the only assayer in Santa Fe, but it's interesting to know that there was one there that was successful. Okay, so artifacts and review. I could go on about any of these artifacts probably for hours. And I don't need to, but so artifacts and review. Spanish olive jar, evidence of global trade in the Spanish Empire. Gold earring, indicator of the vast wealth in Spanish fashion. Jed Higa, linked to European identity and folk Catholicism. Whereas Guadalajara Polychrome, pottery is associated with Mexican identity, Mexican Indian identity, and possibly the Amerindian slave trade. The luggage tag, property of the governor that founded the Santa Fe Ring and destroyed the archives. Whereas the Hunyadi Janos bottle illustrated the patent medicine craze of the 19th century and the lack of proper medical care. Crucibles and Cupels demonstrated the economic impact of mining in territorial New Mexico. And these are the 7 artifacts I chose. With that, I will leave it with a beautiful picture of some of the work we did behind the Palace of the Governors here. It was an amazing time, and it deserves a lot more talks than me just choosing 7 artifacts in which to tell a story. That obviously isn't the whole story behind the Palace of the Governors, but it's going to have to do for today. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and open it up to questions. Todd Griffin asked, did the Spanish colonists create olive jars in New Mexico, or were they all imported? By our knowledge so far, based upon the clays used and the temper used, they look like they were all imported. In fact, they're probably likely all produced in Iberia, somewhere in Spain. That's not to say some weren't produced in the New World, but I don't, because it's so ubiquitous, people don't spend a lot of time with Spanish olive jars. So just because you find them, you think, well, God, people must study them a lot. No, they really don't. They're not that interesting. They're what in essence is an early industrial good that goes back all the way to antiquity. And in fact, some amphora vessels, and I'm probably not saying that right, so I apologize. Amorpha vessels do have flat bottoms. In fact, some olive jars have flat bottoms, but many of them don't. In fact, they pack them into the earth partially, or and sometimes they'll be used as ballast in ships to kind of keep them even when they're floating. But they actually have little holders too that they put them in sometimes, and you can actually see as I said, these things are not rare. These are not uncommon things. You can see these in the Mediterranean today. You might not see the exact forms. In fact, there has been studies done on the olive jar, and the only thing they were able to find as far as change over time in the colonial period is slight changes in the mouth of the vessels. So if that seems not very exciting, it really isn't, because and even then it's not very diagnostic. So over time, there's slight differences in the opening of the vessel. That's about it. The sizes vary over time. The attributes associated, dimensions don't change with time. They're just highly variable. This was a pottery tradition that goes back into the ancient times, and it really was something that it was just part of life. So it's not that exciting. I mean, it sounds exciting, but it's not that exciting. It's really just a look at, in my example is, here's something that's the most common Spanish colonial artifact you're going to find, and many people have never even seen one, and they don't understand why that would be the most common Spanish colonial artifact. But if you start thinking about it, things like olive groves, especially olive groves, and I'm not an expert on olive groves, but it's my understanding that it takes, I think, 100 years for an olive grove to mature, something ridiculously long like that. So if your identity is tied to an Iberian identity, right, or Mediterranean identity, and certainly cuisine includes olive oil. It should include olive oil, right? Northern Europeans know, right, butter or whatever. But for Mediterranean identities, really the classic oil is olive oil. And you're trying to maintain that view of, well, you're Spanish, you're Iberian, you should have these things. Well, one of the things you can't grow in New Mexico, not because of the environment, because it takes so long to get going, that at least for the first 100 years, you've got to import them, right? So these are the vessels by which you import those goods that you cannot produce locally. And that's exactly what you see with these materials. How much of the palace building today, if any of it existed during the time of the Pueblo Revolt? So you should know that there was an earlier building with the Palace of the Governors during the 17th century. The orientation of that building has been discussed by certainly Steve Post, who was one of my mentors. He was the person who hired me at the Office of Archaeological Studies. Dee Dee Snow, who was another mentor. She actually was first met me when I was still an undergraduate before I even started working for the state. She was working at San Marcos Pueblo at the same time. There's a lot of thoughts about what the Palace of the Governors looked like during the 17th century. If you go to the Palace of the Governors today, you can, I don't know if they are still open to the public. I know there was some cultural sensitivities to it. You can look under the floor of the Palace of the Governors. You could and see some of those earlier 17th century floors, as well as some pits excavated by Native American peoples and places modified by Native American peoples during the 17th century. I say all this because we're not sure exactly what that building looked like. In fact, when de Vargas comes back up, he sees a multi-story pueblo where the palace should be. And some people have argued that the palace that was there was taken and that the floors were actually cut in half, and they turned what was a 2-story building into a 4-story pueblo because and they just modified it a lot. In that case, that building was still standing when Europeans came back. However, most of the building, and in fact, what we mostly excavated, even though there was some of those 17th century components, and they're little bit, unfortunately, for a building that's been at the center and heart of colonial New Mexico for such a long time, what you see is an incomplete picture. So later people came and did stuff on top of that, or sometimes dug into that and just changed it. Most of what we documented at the Palace of the Governors was associated with the 18th century structure. So those walls that you saw behind the building, most of those dated, not all, some of them were 17th century. It's hard to get a good idea as to what the 17th century building looked like, but the 18th century building was enormous. In fact, those foundations, some of those foundations were so thick that under Spanish regulations, they would have supported 2 or 3-story tall walls. So the Palace of the Governor during the 18th century was 2 to 3 stories high. And it was much, much larger than the Palace of the Governors you see today. In fact, that building went all the way under Lincoln Avenue over to the Art Museum. It went further west. It was a gigantic building. Now, what did the Anglos see when they showed up in 1846? Not that grand building that had existed in the 18th century. Instead, they saw a building in complete disrepair where the top stories were no longer inhabitable. So the entire top stories have been abandoned. There's no roof on them anymore. They're just all open. It's like almost having like clumps of, it would be like having the ruins at Coronado on top of your house. It looks like clumps of mud just sitting there on the roof, right? It doesn't look very appealing at all for these people from the West. And they're like, and they don't even have doors anymore. They've got animal hides separating some of the rooms. It looks very, very terrible. But the building, has it existed? In fact, this is an important note about New Mexico as a whole, is there's really 2 big growths in New Mexico, right? So in the 17th century, early on in the 17th century, things are going really, really big in New Mexico. Then as the 17th century starts to edge on, New Mexico kind of goes into a period of decline in which the indigenous peoples are able to take advantage of it and revolt. And that's due to famine. It's due to a lot of problems with the Habsburg dynasty. In the 18th century, in the early 18th century, New Mexico in the Spanish colonial empire actually undergoes a huge resurgence under a new dynastic family known as the Bourbons. The Bourbons were that same family, that Louis XIV family. He was told he couldn't rule Spain, and he fought a war to put his grandson on the throne of Spain, and he lost the war, but in the end, his grandson still got on the throne of Spain. They just said France and Spain could never become the same nation, and Louis was okay with that. So the Bourbons started to control Spain, and the Bourbons in Louis' court, as you can imagine, as people look at, is the grand, the epicenter of French culture, right? We tend to think of, even when we do dramatic Disney movies such as Beauty and the Beast, really what we're referring to there is Bourbon dynasty France, right? We're talking about the golden age of France. Well, that same golden age transfers over into Spain under the Bourbons. They have this huge resurgence and revitalization, and Santa Fe enjoyed some of that revitalization under the Bourbon dynasty, and we certainly see that in construction programs, both at the palace, but also if we look at Santa Fe as a whole. 18th century is actually, the early 18th century is very good to New Mexico, and in fact, it's a very dynamic and probably exciting time to be in the colonies. Now, once again, you have this big burst of spending and stuff like that. It's really exciting, and then it goes into this period of decline, and so on. But it was an important time for New Mexico. So hopefully that helps a little bit. I could explain the architectural history better by actually pointing out what's there today to explore it. In fact, if you go into the Palace of the Governors, you'll notice, especially in the I'm not saying this correctly. If you go in, it's almost like there's two buildings of the palace, right? There's the first building, and then there's the courtyard, and then there's the second building, right? And if you go to the first building, you sit in one of those window wells, you'll notice that the wall is really, really thick. And the foundation for that wall is really, really thick. And yes, adobe walls have to be thick, but they don't have to be that thick. What you're looking at there is a wall that was originally built not to support the structure that's there now, but to support multiple stories above that. So that wall was built to build up multiple stories. So even though the building's really squat, not very tall today, the building that wall was built for, that wall was built to house a building that's much, much taller. So you're looking at something that's been completely cut down and reshaped, and is really not a good representation of a Spanish provincial government building in the 18th century. It's actually a poor example. It makes it look much smaller and unimpressive compared to what it was. It's also been taken over with a lot of Pueblo revival style architectural elements, which are absolutely uncharacteristic of what the Spanish would have. They would have never in a million years followed Pueblo. Pueblo revival style is a construction of the early 20th century, not of the Spanish colonial period. Betty has a question.
Okay, and you kind of answered one, but I back to the Higa and the profane early folklore symbol. Was that emerging about the same time that the Protestant Reformation was happening? And were those two threats to the traditional Catholic Church?
So, well, sort of, yes. So the Higa symbol actually goes back to about like 400 BC. So it's a ridiculously old symbol. But the crackdown on folk Catholicism is definitely associated with the Protestant Reformation. So what is happening in Europe during the 1500s is, up until this point in the Middle Ages, you could be Catholic and do all sorts of crazy pagan things that your ancestors did. So how you practiced Catholicism in Germany and how you practiced Catholicism in Spain really had nothing to do with a Christian identity. It had to do with your own individual cultural traditions that you had done for millions of years. And in many ways, these medieval societies, many of these medieval societies were highly tolerant, not only of folk, of different Catholic practices, but of other religious groups living among them as well. So, for example, in Poland, which we've talked about a lot before, you have people like King Casimir, who's interested in having lots of Jewish subjects, as looking as ways to prop up his own authority. But in Spain, you also had Islamic peoples up until very recently. And these people were allowed, even if they were in a Latin kingdom, they were allowed pretty much to practice. Protestant Reformation was seen as an internal threat in the 16th century, and one that they really had to crack down on, because it was coming from a lot of these groups, and it was looked at as many of these groups have been allowed a lot of religious freedom on how to interpret Catholic works. And they really want to crack down on it. And a lot of countries do crack down on it. And these pragmaticas by Charles are really the first attempts to start to crack down on that. But the other, of course, the very important one that you see also increasing at the same time is the Inquisition. So the crackdown on non-Christian practices and the targeting of these peoples for a variety of reasons. So that's what you're seeing with those.
Mini question. Another one. Field trips, or you've been taking people to the Palace of the Governors to talk about the architecture, right?
I've done some, yes.
What about us? Can you take us there sometime?
For right now, no. Unfortunately, I can't. Later, maybe. The reason I was able to do a lot of those trips and I ended up talking a lot about the architectural history is recently they were pulling out all the exhibits from the Palace of the Governors. So they had pulled back all the plaster and stuff like that. And I was able to give a detailed tour going through both a archaeological and architectural history of the Palace of the Governors. I can look into something like that in the future, but I cannot guarantee it would come true. That was something I did through the History Museum itself. So I can't speak to that. And obviously with COVID safe practices right now, I'd have to say respectfully, first of all, I don't think they would allow it, but even if they did, I'd have to say no because of my job right now. But in the future, absolutely. The Palace of the Governors is a very important part in New Mexico history.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you. Have a good day, guys. I will see you all soon. Please come out and visit us.